guys. So, we're back to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, Part 2. Hopefully, I don't die this time, like I did last time. Alright, so we're on Chapter 5. Prostetnik Vogon Jelt was not a pleasant sight, even for other Vogons. His highly domed nose rose high above a small piggy forehead. His dark green rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the game of Vogon civil service politics, and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to survive indefinitely at sea depths of down to 1,000 feet with no ill effects. Not that he ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because billions of years ago, when the Vogons had first crawled out of the sluggish primeval seas of Vogsphere and had lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores, when the first rays of the bright young Vauxhall sun had shone across them that morning. It was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them there and then and had turned aside in disgust and written them off as an ugly, unfortunate mistake. And they never evolved again. They should never have survived. The fact that they did is some kind of tribute to the thick-willed, slug-brained stubbornness of these creatures. Evolution, they said to themselves, who needs it? And what nature refused to do for them, they simply did without until such time as they were able to rectify the gross anatomical inconveniences with surgery. My dog is clawing his way into the room, sorry. Meanwhile, the natural forces on the planet Vogsphere had been working overtime to make up for their earlier blunder. They brought forth scintillating, jeweled scuttling crabs, which the Vogons ate, smashing their shells with iron mallets, tall aspiring trees of breathtaking slenderness and color, which the Vogons cut down and burned the crab meat with, elegant gazelle-like creatures with silken coats and dewy eyes, which the Vogons would catch and sit on. They were no use as transport because their backs would snap instantly, but the Vogons sat on them anyway. Thus the planet Vogsphere whiled away the unhappy millennia until the Vogons suddenly discovered the principles of interstellar travel. Within a few short Vog years, every last Vogon had migrated to the Megabrantis cluster, the political hub of the galaxy, and now formed the immensely powerful backbone of the galactic civil service. They have attempted to acquire learning. They have attempted to acquire style and social graces, but in most respects, the modern Vogon is little different from his primitive forebears. Every year, they import 27,000 scintillating jeweled scuttling crabs from their native planet and while away a happy drunken night, smashing them to bits with iron mallets. Prostetnik Vogon Jelt was a fairly typical Vogon in that he was thoroughly vile. Also, he did not like hitchhikers. Surprising. Somewhere in the small dark cabin, buried deep in the intestines of the Prostetnik Vogon Jelt's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them, and was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. He looked about the cabin, but could see very little. Strange, monstrous shadows loomed and leapt like tiny flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentrasis. The Dentrasis are an unruly tribe of Gormans, a wild but pleasant bunch whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they kept themselves very much to themselves. This suited the Dentrasis fine because they love Vogon money, which is one of the hardest currencies in space, but loathes the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon a Dentrasi liked to see was an annoyed Vogon. It was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan. By the light of the match, he saw a heavy shape moving slightly on the floor. Quickly, he shook the match out, reached in his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. He crouched on the floor. The shape moved again. Ford Prefect said, "I bought some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved and groaned again, muttering incoherently. "Here, have some," urged Ford, shaking the packet again. "If you've never been through a matter transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have cushioned your system a bit." Said Arthur Dent. He opened his eyes. "It's dark," he said. "Yes," said Ford Prefect, "it is dark." "No light," said Arthur Dent. "Dark, no light." One of the many things Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious. As in, "It's a nice day," or "You're very tall," or "Oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well. Are you alright?" At first, At first, Ford had formed a theory to account for this strange behavior. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths would probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favor of a new one. If they don't keep on exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while, he abandoned this one as well, being obstructively cynical, and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things they didn't know about. Yes, he agreed with Arthur. "No light." He helped Arthur to some peanuts. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like a military academy," said Arthur. "Bits of me keep on passing out." Ford stared at him blankly in the darkness. "If I asked you where the hell we were," said Arthur weakly, "would I regret it?" Ford stood up. "We're safe," he said. "Oh, good," said Arthur. "We're in a small galley cabin," said Ford, "in one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet." "Ah," said Arthur, "this is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I wasn't previously aware of." Ford struck another match to help him search for a light switch. Monstrous shadows leapt and loomed again. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick and with musty smells, which sidled into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. "How did we get here?" he asked, shivering slightly. "We hitched a lift," said Ford. "Excuse me?" said Arthur. "Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumbs and some green bug-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, 'Hi, fellas, hop right in. I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout.'" "Well," said Ford, "the thumb's an electronic Sabitha signaling device. The roundabout's at Bernard's star 6 light years away, but otherwise that's more or less right." "And the bug-eyed monster is green, yes." "Fine," said Arthur. "When can I go home?" "You can't," said Ford Prefect, and found the light switch. "Shade your eyes," he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. "Good grief," said Arthur. "Is this really the interior of a flying saucer?" Prostetnik Vogon Gelt heaved his unpleasant green body around the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing populated planets. He wished that someone would come and tell him that it was all wrong so that he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto his control seat in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about, but it only gave a complaining sort of creak. "Go away!" he shouted at a young Vogon guard who entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately. Feeling rather relieved, he was glad that it wouldn't now be him who delivered the report they'd just received. The report was an official release which said that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was at this moment being unveiled at a government research base on Damagran, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout because it was the door from the galley quarters where the Dentrasis prepared his meals. A meal would be most welcome. A huge furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was delighted. He knew that when a Dentrasi looked that pleased with itself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship that he could get very angry indeed about. Ford and Arthur stared around them. "Well, what do you think?" said Ford. "It's a bit squalid, isn't it?" Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. "Well, this is a working ship, you see," said Ford. "These are the Dentrasis sleeping quarters. I thought you said they were called Vogons or something." "Yes," said Ford. "The Vogons run the ship. The Dentrasis are the cooks. They let us on board." "I'm confused," said Arthur. "Here, have a look at this," said Ford. He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about in his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattress nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about, because all mattresses grown in the swamps of Scornschellus Zeta are very thoroughly killed and dried before being put to service. Very few have ever come to life again. Ford handed the book to Arthur. "What is it?" asked Arthur. "The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job." Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. "I like the cover," he said. "Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody said to me all day." "I'll show you how it works," said Ford. He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it were a 2-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover. "You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index." A screen about 3 inches by 4 lit up, and characters began to flicker across the surface. "You want to know about Vogons? So I entered that name, so..." His finger tapped some more keys, and there we are. The words Vogon Constructor Fleets flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button, and at the bottom of the screen the words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well, in a still, quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. "Vogon Constructor Fleets. Here's what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trawl, without order signed in triplicate. Sent in, sent back, quarried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in a soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down its throat, and the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trawl. Oh no, on no account allow a Vogon to read poetry to you." Arthur blinked at it. "What a strange book. How did we get a lift then?" That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to do is include a bit about how the Vogons now employ Dentrasi cooks, which gives us a rather useful little loophole. A pained expression across Arthur's face, but who are the Dentrasis? He said. Great guys, said Ford. They're the best cooks and the best drink mixers, and they don't give a wet slap about anything else, and they'll always help hitchhikers aboard, partly because they like the company and mostly because it annoys the Vogons, which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're an impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. And that's my job. Fun, isn't it? Arthur looked lost. It's amazing, he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses. Unfortunately, I got stuck on Earth for rather longer than I intended, said Ford. I came for a week and got stuck for 15 years. But how did you get there in the first place then? Easy, I got a lift with a teaser. A teaser? Yeah. What is a teaser? Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets that haven't made interstellar contact yet and buzz them. Buzz them? Arthur began to feel that Ford was enjoying making life difficult for him. Yeah, said Ford. They buzz them. They find some isolated spot with very few people around, then land right by some poor, unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe, and then strut up and down in front of him wearing silly antennas on their head and making beep-beep noises. Rather childish, really. Ford leaned back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. Ford insisted Arthur. I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but what am I doing here? Well, you know, said Ford, I rescued you from the Earth. And what's happened to the Earth? Ah, it's been demolished. Has it? said Arthur levelly. Yeah, it just boiled away into space. Look, said Arthur, I'm a bit upset about that. Ford frowned to himself and seemed to roll the thought around in his mind. Yeah, I can understand that, he said at last. Understand that? Shouted Arthur. Understand that? Ford sprang up. Keep looking at the book, he hissed urgently. What? Don't panic. I'm not panicking. Yes, you are. All right, so I'm panicking. What else is there to do? You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your ear. I beg your pardon, asked Arthur rather politely. He thought Ford was holding up a small glass jar, which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around inside it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp a hold of. He would have felt safe if, alongside the Dentrasis underwear, the piles of scorn-shelless mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding up a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, he had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes, but he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly a violent noise leapt at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle while fighting off a pack of wolves. Shush, said Ford. Listen, it might be important. Important? It's the Vogon captain making an announcement on the Tannoy. You mean that's how the Vogons talk? Listen. But I can't speak Vogon. You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear. Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear, and he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his oral tract. Gasping with horror, he scrabbled at his ear for a second or so, but then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the oral equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick, or of looking at a lot of colored dots on a piece of paper and suddenly resolve themselves into the figure 6. and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles. He knew that now it had somehow taken on the semblance of perfectly straightforward English. This is what he heard. Chapter 6. Howl, howl, gargle, howl, gargle, howl, howl, gargle, howl, gargle, howl, howl, gargle, gargle, howl, gargle, 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 howl, slurp, herb. Should have a good time. Message repeats. This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, wherever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not welcome at all. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I've sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we are about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Bernard Star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for 72-hour refit, and nobody's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is canceled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anybody else should have a good time. Message ends. The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. Charming man, he said. I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one. You wouldn't need to, said Ford. They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident. No, don't move, he added as Arthur began to uncurl himself. You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk. What's so unpleasant about being drunk? You ask a glass of water. Arthur thought about this. Ford, he said, yeah? What's this fish doing in my ear? It's translating for you. It's a babblefish. Look it up in the book if you like. He tossed over the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. The babblefish, said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. Then it excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with the nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain, which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a babblefish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix, which has been fed into your mind by your babblefish. Now it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. I refuse to prove that I exist, says God, for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. But, says man, the babblefish is is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore, by your own argument, you don't. QED. Oh dear, says God. I hadn't thought of that, and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. Oh, that was easy, says man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white, and gets himself killed on the next pedestrian crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of Dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Ulan Khulufid making a small fortune when he used it as the central theme of his best-selling book. Well, that about wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor babblefish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. The visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he had been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before, and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry, because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He got that. Somehow he'd got that. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He decided to start smaller again. New York, gone. No reaction. He'd never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought, there's no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out, and when he came around a second later, he found that he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said, if you're a researcher on this book thing, and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it says in this edition then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay, he passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hand shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, down there. See at the bottom of the screen, just above Eccentrica Golumbits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment, it still didn't register. Then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. There were 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said, and no one knew much about the Earth. Of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentrasses, whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. There was a sharp ringing rap on the door. Then who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat. He's going to read us some of his poetry first. Wait, I think that video ended, but it's gonna keep going. Alright, so chapter 7. Vogon poetry is one of the third worst in the universe. The second worst is that of Asgoths of Krea. During a recitation by their poet master Grunthos, the flatulent, of his poem Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Noveling Council survived by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception, and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favorite Bath Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, and in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prostetnik Vogon Jelt smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs strapped in. The Vogons suffered no illusions as to the regard of their works, their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as a properly evolved and cultured race, but now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody mindedness. The sweat stood out cold on Ford Prefect's brow and slid around the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment, imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far, and didn't think that things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read a fetid little passage of his own devising. "Oh, fraddled grunt-bugly," he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than he'd been prepared for, yeah?
I woke up in my dad's room. What time is it?
It's 11. You should be asleep, bro. Good night. Where was I? He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far, and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read a fetid little passage of his own devising. Oh, Fred, old grunt bugly, he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he'd been prepared for. Thy micturations are to me as furled gobble blotchets on a lurgid v arg, went Ford prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth. Group, I implore thee, continued the merciless Vogon. My fountain turling drums. His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impression, stridency, and hooptiously drangle me with crinkly bindle wordles. What? Bindle wordles. Yeah. Or I will rend thee in the gobberwarts with my blurgen crunchion. See if I don't. No, cried Ford Prefect. And through one final spasm, as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples, he went limp. Arthur lulled. Now, Earthlings, roared the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice, and simply wouldn't have cared if he had. I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or... He paused for a melodramatic effect. Tell me how good you thought my poem was. He threw himself backward into a huge leathery bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue around his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said quite brightly, Actually, I quite liked it. Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose, and was therefore no bad thing. Oh, good, he whirred in considerable astonishment. Oh, yes, said Arthur. I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective. Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organizing his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this? Yes, do continue, invited the Vogon. Oh, and interesting rhythmic devices, too, continued Arthur, which seemed to counterpoint the, he floundered. Ford leapt to his rescue, hazarding counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the year. He floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. Humanity of the Vogonity, Ford hissed at him. Ah, yes, Vogonity. Sorry, of the poet's compassionate soul. Arthur felt he was on a home stretch now, which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other. He was reaching a triumphant crescendo, and one is left with a profound and vivid insight into, which suddenly gave out on him. Ford leapt in with a coup de grace, into whatever it was the poem was about, he yelled out of the corner of his mouth. Well done, Arthur, that was very good. The Vogon perused him. For a moment, his embittered racial soul had been touched, but he thought, no, too little, too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon. So what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved, he said. He paused. Is that right? Ford laughed a nervous laugh. Well, I mean, yes, he said. Don't we all deep down, The Vogon stood up. No, "Well, you're completely wrong," he said. "I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out." "What?" shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge blubbery arms. "You can't throw us into space," yelled Ford. "We're trying to write a book." "Resistance is useless," shouted the Vogon guard back at them. It was the first phrase he'd learned when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared. Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on. Where was I? Arthur stared around him wildly. "Now I don't want to die now," he yelled. "I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it." The guard grasped them both firmly around the neck and bowing deferentially toward his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting off the bridge. A steel door closed, and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said, counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor. He considered this for a moment and then closed the book with a grim smile. "Death is too good for them," he said. This long steel-lined corridor echoed to the feeble struggles of the 2 humanoid clamped firmly under rubbery Vogon armpits. "This is great," spluttered Arthur. "This is really terrific. Let go of me, you brute." The Vogon guard dragged them on. "Don't you worry," said Ford. "I'll think of something." He didn't sound hopeful. "Resistance is useless," bellowed the guard. "Just don't say things like that," stammered Ford. "How can anyone maintain a positive mental attitude if you're saying things like that?" "My God," complained Arthur, "you're talking about a positive mental attitude, and you haven't even had your planet demolished today? I woke up this morning and thought I'd have a nice relaxed day, do a bit of reading, brush the dog. Now it's just after 4 in the afternoon, and I'm already being thrown out of an alien spaceship 6 light years from the smoking remains of the Earth." He spluttered and gurgled as the Vogon tightened his grip. "All right," said Ford, "just stop panicking." "Who said anything about panicking?" snapped Arthur. This is still just the culture shock. You wait till I've settled down into the situation and found my bearings. Then I'll start panicking." "Arthur, you're getting hysterical." "Shut up." Ford tried desperately to think, but was interrupted by the guard shouting again. "Alright guys, I'm gonna have to let you go because my kiddo needs to go to sleep and I'm keeping him awake by reading. But yes, I will be back on shortly. Namaste, see you guys soon. Alright, good morning. Alright, let's get back into this story. My kid forced me to go to bed last night. He couldn't sleep because I was reading a book. So, now that I have some quiet time, let's get into it. It's funny because as a kid, I actually got in trouble for reading books quite a lot. Trying to stay up all night with the lights. I think it's the best rebellion to keep holding on to into my adulthood. Alright, so, where were we? "Resistance is useless." "And you can shut up as well," snapped Ford. "Resistance is useless." "Oh, give it a rest," said Ford. He twisted his head till he was looking straight up into his captor's face. A thought struck him. Do you really enjoy this sort of thing? He asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead, and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly over his face. Enjoy? He boomed. What do you mean? What I mean, said Ford, is does it give you a full, satisfying life? Stomping around, shouting, pushing people out of spaceships. The Vogon stared up at the low steel ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally, he said, well, the hours are good. They'd have to be, agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head around to look at Ford. Ford, what are you doing? He asked in an amazed whisper. Oh, just trying to take an interest in the world around me, okay? He said. So the hours are pretty good then, he resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in the murky depths. Yeah, he said, but now you come to mention it. Most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except, he thought again, which required looking at the ceiling, some of the shouting I quite like. He filled his lungs and bellowed, Resistances! Sure, yes, interrupted Ford hurriedly. You're good at that, I can tell, but if it's mostly lousy, he said, slowly giving the words time to reach their mark, then why do you do it? What is it? The girls? The leather? The machismo? Or do you just find that coming to terms with the mindless tedium of all it presents an uninteresting challenge? Arthur looked backwards and forward between them in bafflement. Said the guard. I don't know, I just sort of do it, really. My aunt said that spaceship guard was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung stun ray holster, the mindless tedium. There you are, Arthur, said Ford with the air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. You think you've got problems. Arthur rather thought he had. Apart from the unpleasant business with his home planet, the Vogon guard had half-throttled him already, and he didn't like the sound of being thrown into space very much. Try and understand his problem, insisted Ford. Here he is. Poor lad, his entire life's work is stamping around, throwing people off ships. And shouting, added the guard. And shouting, sure, said Ford, patting the blubbery arm clamped around his neck in friendly condescension, and he doesn't even know why he's doing it. Arthur agreed that this was very sad. He did this with a small, feeble gesture, because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of amusement came from the guard. Well, now you put it like that, I suppose. Good lad, encouraged Ford. But all right, went on the rumbling. So what's the alternative? Well, said Ford, brightly but slowly. Stop doing it, of course. Tell them, he went on, you're not going to do it anymore. He felt he ought to add something to that, but for the moment the guard seemed to have had his mind occupied pondering that much. Said the guard. Well, that doesn't sound that great to me. Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. Now wait a minute, he said. That's just the start, you see. There's more to it than that, you see. But at the moment the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging his prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. Now, I think if it's all the same to you, he said, I'd better get you both shoved off into this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits and shouting I've got to do. It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. Come on now. But look, he said, less slowly and less brightly. Said Arthur without any clear inflection. But hang on, pursued Ford. There's music and art and things to tell you about yet. Resistance is useless, bellowed the guard, and then added, You see, if I keep it up, I can eventually get promoted to senior shouting officer. And there aren't usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about the officers. So I think I'd better stick to what I know. They had now reached the airlock, a large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated the control and the hatchway swung smoothly open. "But thanks for taking an interest," said the Vogon. Bye now." He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. Arthur lay panting for breath. Ford scrambled around and flung his shoulder uselessly against the reclosing hatchway. "But listen," he shouted to the guard. "There's a whole world you don't know anything about. Here, how about this?" And desperately he grabbed for the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-da-da-da. "Doesn't that stir anything in you?" "No," said the guard, "not really, but I'll mention it to my aunt." If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost except the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. They were in a brightly polished cylindrical chamber for about 6 feet, about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet long. Ford looked around it, panting. "Potentially a bright lad, I thought," he said, and then slumped. "Potentially bright lad, I thought," he said, and slumped against the curved wall. Arthur was still lying in the curve of the floor where he had fallen. He didn't look up, just lay panting. "We're trapped now, aren't we? We're trapped." "Yes," said Ford, "we're trapped." "Well, didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to do something." "Little meow meow. Hello? Hello?" Okay. Where was I? "Didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to think of something. Perhaps you thought of something, and I didn't notice." "Oh, yes, I thought of something," panted Ford. Arthur looked up expectantly. "But unfortunately," continued Ford, "it rather involved being on the other side of this airtight hatchway." He kicked the hatch they'd been just thrown through. "But it was a good idea, wasn't it?" "Oh, yes, very neat." "What was it?" "Well, I hadn't worked out the details yet." "Not much point now, is there?" So what happens next?" asked Arthur. "Well, the hatchway in front of us will open automatically in a few moments, and we will shoot into deep space, and I expect and asphyxiate. If you take a lungful of air with you, you can last for up to 30 seconds, of course," said Ford. He stuck his hand behind his back, raised his eyebrow, and started to hum the old Beetlejuicean battle hymn. To Arthur's eyes, he suddenly looked very alien. "So this is it," said Arthur. "We're going to die." "Yes," said Ford, "except no. Wait a minute." He lunged across the chamber at something behind Arthur's line of vision. "What's this switch?" he cried. "What? Where?" cried Arthur, twisting around. "No, I was only fooling," said Ford. "We are going to die after all." He slumped against the wall again and carried the tune from where he had left off. "You know," said Arthur, "it's at times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young." "Why, what did she tell you?" "I don't know. I didn't listen." "Oh," Ford carried on humming. "This is terrific," Arthur thought to himself. Nelson's column had gone. McDonald's has gone. All that's left is me and the words, "mostly harmless." Any second now, all that will be left is "mostly harmless." And yesterday, the planet seemed to be going so well. A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened onto an empty blackness studded with tiny, impossibly bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped out into outer space like corks from a toy gun. Chapter 8. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book. It has been compiled and recompiled many times over many years and under many different editorships. It contained contributions from countless numbers of travelers and researchers. The introduction begins like this. Space, it says, is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space. Listen, and so on. After a while, the style settles down a bit, and it begins to tell you things you really need to know, like the fact that the fabulously beautiful planet Bethlehem is now worried about the cumulative erosion by 10 billion visiting tourists a year. That any net imbalance between the amount you eat and the amount you excrete while on the planet is surgically removed from your body weight when you leave. So every time you have to go to the lavatory there, it is vitally important to get a receipt. To be fair, though, when confronted by the sheer enormousness of the distances between the stars, better minds than the one responsible for the guide's introductions have faltered. Some invite you to consider for a moment a peanut in reading and a small walnut in Johannesburg, and other such dizzying concepts. The simple truth is that interstellar distances will not fit into the human imagination. Even light, which travels so fast that it takes most races thousands of years to realize that it travels at all, it takes time to journey between the stars. It takes 8 minutes to journey from the star Sol to the place where the Earth used to be, and 4 years more to arrive at the Sol's nearest stellar neighbor, Alpha Proxima. For light to reach the other side of the galaxy, for it to reach the Demogran, for instance, takes rather longer. 500,000 years. The record for hitchhiking this distance is under 5 years. But you don't get to see much on the way. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says that if you hold a lungful of air, you can survive in the total vacuum of space for about 30 seconds. However, it does go on to say that with space being the mind-boggling size that it is, the chances of getting picked up by another ship within those 30 seconds are 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. By a total staggering coincidence, that is also the telephone number of an Islington flat where Arthur once went to a very good party and met a very nice girl whom he'd totally failed to get off with. She went off with a gatecrasher. Though the planet Earth, the Islington flat, and the telephone have all now been demolished, it is comforting to reflect that they are all in some small way commemorated by the fact that 29 seconds later, Ford and Arthur were rescued. What are the odds? Actually, I just found out the odds. Chapter 9. A computer chattered to itself in alarm as it noticed an airlock open and close itself for no apparent reason. This was because reason was in fact out to lunch. A hole had just appeared in the galaxy. It was exactly a nothingth of a second long, a nothingth of an inch wide, and quite a lot of millions of light years from end to end. As it closed up, lots of paper hats and party balloons fell out of it and drifted off through the universe. A team of 7 3-foot-high market analysts fell out of it and died, partly of asphyxiation, partly of surprise. 239,000 lightly fried eggs fell out of it too, materializing in a large wobbly heap on the famine-struck land of Pogril and the Pansel system. The whole Pogril tribe had died out from famine, except for one last man who died of cholesterol poisoning some weeks later. The nothingth of a second for which the whole existed reverberated backwards and forward through time in a most improbable fashion. Somewhere in the deeply remote past, it seriously traumatized a small random group of atoms drifting through the empty sterility of space and made them cling together in the most extraordinarily unlikely patterns. These patterns quickly learned to copy themselves. This was part of what was so extraordinary about the patterns, and went on to cause massive trouble on every planet that they drifted onto. That was how life began in the universe. 5 wild event maelstroms swirled in vicious storms of unreason and spewed up a pavement. On the pavement lay Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent, gulping like half-spent fish. "There you are," gasped Ford, scrabbling for a finger to hold on to the pavement as it raced through the third reach of the unknown. "I told you I'd think of something." "Oh, sure," said Arthur. "Sure." "Bright idea of mine," said Ford, "to find a passing spaceship and get rescued by it." The real universe arched sickeningly away beneath them. Various pretend ones flitted silently by, like mountain goats. Primal light exploded, splattering space-time as with gobbets of jello. And time blossomed, matter shrank away. The highest prime number coalesced quietly in a corner and hid itself away forever. "Oh, come off it," said Arthur. The chances against it were astronomical." "Don't knock it, it works," said Ford. "What sort of ship are we in?" asked Arthur, as the pit of eternity yawned beneath them. "I don't know," said Ford. "I haven't opened my eyes yet." "No, nor have I," said Arthur. The universe jumped, froze, quivered, and splayed out in several unexpected directions. Arthur and Ford opened their eyes and looked about in considerable surprise. "Good God," said Arthur. "It looks just like the sea front at Southend." "Hell, I'm relieved to hear you say that," said Ford. "Why?" "Because I thought I must be going mad." "Perhaps you are. Perhaps you only thought I said it." Ford thought about this. "Well, did you say it or didn't you?" he asked. "I think so," said Arthur. "Well, perhaps we're both going mad." "Yes," said Arthur. "We'd be mad, all things considered, to think that this was Southend." "Well, do you think this is Southend?" "Yes. Well, so do I. Therefore, we must be mad." "Nice day for it." "Yes," said a passing maniac. "Who was that?" asked Arthur. "Who, the man with the 5 heads and the elderberry bush full of kippers?" "Yes." "I don't know, just someone." "Ah." They both sat on the pavement and watched with a certain unease as huge children bounced heavily along the sand and wild horses thundered through the sky, taking fresh supplies of reinforced railings to the uncertain areas. "You know," said Arthur, with a slight cough, "if this is Southend, there's something very odd about it." "You mean the way the sea stays steady as a rock and the buildings keep washing up and down?" Said Ford. "Yes. I thought that was odd too, in fact," he continued, as with a huge bang, Southend split itself into 6 equal segments which danced and spun giddily around each other in lewd and licentious formations. "There is something altogether very strange going on. Wild yowling noises of pipes and strings seared through the wind. Hot doughnuts popped out of the road for 10 pence each. Horrid fish stormed out of the sky, and Arthur and Ford decided to make a run for it. They plunged through the heavy walls of sound, mountains of archaic thought, valleys of mood music, bad shoe sessions, and fiddling bats. and suddenly heard a girl's voice. It sounded like a quite sensible voice, but it just said 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against and falling. And that was all. Ford skated down a beam of light and spun around, trying to find a source for the voice, but could see nothing he could seriously believe in. What was that voice? Shouted Arthur. I don't know yet, yelled Ford. I don't know. It sounded like a measurement of probability. Probability? What do you mean? Probability, like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 4 against. It is 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against. That's pretty improbable, A 1,000,000-gallon vat of custard upended itself over them without warning. But what does it mean? Cried Arthur. What, the custard? No, the measurement of improbability. I don't know at all. I think we're on some kind of spaceship. I can only assume, said Arthur, that this is not the first-class compartment. Bulges appeared in the fabric of space-time. Great, ugly bulges. Ugh, said Arthur, as he felt his body softening and bending in unusual directions. Southend seems to be melting away. The stars are swirling a dust bowl. My legs are drifting off into the sunset. My left arm's come off too. A frightening thought struck him. Hell, he said. How am I going to operate my digital watch now? He wound his eyes desperately around Ford's direction. Ford, he said, you're turning into a penguin. Stop it. Again came the voice. 2 to the power of 75,000 to 1 against and falling. Ford waddled around his pond in a furious cycle. Hey, who are you? He quacked. Where are you? What's going on? And is there any way of stopping it? Please relax, said the voice pleasantly, like a stewardess in an airliner with only one wing and 2 engines, one of which is on fire. You are perfectly safe. But that's not the point, raged Ford. The point is that I am now a perfectly safe penguin, and my colleague here is rapidly running out of limbs. It's all right, I've got them back now, said Arthur. 2 to the power of 50,000 to 1 against and falling, said the voice. Admittedly, said Arthur, they're longer than I usually like them, but isn't there anything, squawked Ford in an avian fury, you feel you ought to be telling us? The voice cleared its throat. A giant petite for lolloped off into the distance. Welcome, the voice said, to the starship Heart of Gold. The voice continued, please do not be alarmed, it said, by anything you see or hear around you. You are bound to feel some initial ill effects, as you have been rescued from certain death at an improbability level of 2 to the power of 276,000 to 1 against. Possibly much higher. We're now cruising at a level of 2 to the power of 75,000 to 1 against and falling, and we will be restoring normality just as soon as we are sure what normal is anyway. Thank you. 2 to the power of 20,000 to 1 against and falling. The voice cut out. Ford and Arthur were in a small, luminous pink cubicle. Ford was wildly excited. Arthur, he said, this is fantastic. We've been picked up by a ship powered by the infinite improbability drive. This is incredible. I heard rumors about it before. They were all officially denied, but they must have done it. They built the improbability drive. Arthur, what's happening? Arthur had jammed himself against the door to the cubicle, trying to hold it closed, but it was ill-fitting. Tiny furry little hands were squeezing themselves through the cracks. Their fingers were ink-stained. Tiny voices chattered insanely. Arthur looked up. Ford, he said, there's an infinite number of monkeys outside who want to talk to us about this script for Hamlet they've worked on. Chapter 10. The infinite improbability drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances in a mere nothing of a second, without all that tedious mucking about in hyperspace. It was discovered by a lucky chance and then developed into a governable form of propulsion by the Galactic Government's research team on Demogran. This briefly is the story of its discovery. The principle of generating small amounts of finite improbability by simply hooking the logic circuits of the Bumblebee 57 submeson brain to an atomic vector plotter suspended in a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, were of course well understood, and such generators were often used to break the ice at parties by making all the molecules in the hostess's undergarments leap simultaneously, one foot to the left, in accordance with the theory of indeterminacy. Many respectable physicists said that they weren't going to stand for this, partly because it was a debasement of science, but mostly because they didn't get invited to those sorts of parties. Another thing they couldn't stand was the perpetual failure they encountered in trying to construct a machine which could generate the infinite improbability field needed to flip a spaceship across the mind-paralyzing distances between the farthest stars. And in the end, they grumpily announced that such a machine was virtually impossible. Then one day, a student who had been left to sweep up the lab after a particularly unsuccessful party found himself reasoning this way. If, he thought to himself, such a machine is virtually impossible, then it must logically be a finite improbability. So, all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is. Feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. He did this and was rather startled to discover that he had managed to create the long sought after golden infinite improbability generator out of thin air. It startled him even more when just after he was awarded the Galactic Institute's prize for extreme cleverness, he got lynched by a rampaging mob of respectable physicists who had finally realized that the one thing they couldn't stand was a smartass. Honestly, physicists only love you if you're dumber than them. Okay, let's be real. Let's be real. I dare you to challenge one's. Just challenge one. Alright. Chapter 11. The improbability-proof control cabin of the Heart of Gold looked like a perfectly conventional spaceship, except that it was perfectly clean because it was so new. Some of the control seats hadn't had the plastic wrapping taken off yet. The cabin was mostly white, oblong, and about the size of a smallish restaurant. In fact, it wasn't perfectly oblong. The two long walls were raked around in a slight parallel curve, and all the angles and corners of the cabin were contoured in excitingly chunky shapes. The truth of the matter is that it would have been a great deal simpler and more practical to build the cabin as an ordinary three-dimensional oblong room. But then the designers would have got miserable. The cabin looked excitingly purposeful, with large video screens ranged over the control and guidance system panels on the concave wall, and long banks of computers set into the convex wall. In one corner, a robot sat humped, its gleaming brushed steel head hanging loosely between its gleaming brushed steel knees. It too was fairly new, but though it was beautifully constructed and polished, it somehow looked as if the various parts of its more or less humanoid body didn't quite fit properly. In fact, they fitted perfectly well, but something in its bearing suggested that they might have fitted better. Zaphod Beeblebrox paced nervously up and down the cabin, brushing his hands over pieces of gleaming equipment and giggling with excitement. Trillian sat hunched over a clump of instruments, reading off figures. Her voice was carried around the Chinoy system of the whole ship. 5 to 1 against and falling, she said. 4 to 1 against and falling. 3 to 1, 2 to 1. Probability factor of 1 to 1. We have normality. I repeat, we have normality. She turned her microphone off and then turned it back on with a slight smile and continued. Anything you still can't cope with is therefore your own problem. Please relax, you will be sent for soon. Zaphod burst out in annoyance. Who are they, Trillian? Trillian spun her seat around to face him and shrugged. Just a couple of guys we seem to have picked up in the open space, she said. Section ZZ, plural Z alpha. Yeah, well, that's a very sweet thought, Trillian, complained Zaphod, but do you really think it's wise under the circumstances? I mean, here we are on the run and everything, and we must have the police of half the galaxy after us by now, and we stopped to pick up hitchhikers. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking, yeah? He tapped irritably at a control panel. Trillian quietly moved his hand before he tapped anything important. Whatever Zaphod's qualities of mind might include dash, bravado, conceit, he was mechanically inept and could easily blow the ship up with an extravagant gesture. Trillian had come to suspect that the main reason he had had such a wild and successful life was that he never really understood the significance of anything he did. Zaphod, she said patiently. They were floating unprotected in open space. You wouldn't want them to have died, would you? Well, no, not as much, but not as much. Not die as such. Not as such, but not as such. Not die as such. But Trillian cocked her head on one side. Well, maybe someone else might have picked them up later. A second later and they would have been dead. Yeah, so if you'd taken the trouble to think about the problem a bit longer, it would have gone away. Well, you'd have been happy to let them die. Well, not happy as such, but anyway, Trillian said, turning back to the controls. I didn't pick them up. What do you mean? Who picked them up then? The ship did. Huh? The ship did, all by itself. Huh? Well, we were in the improbability drive. But that's incredible. No, Zaphod, just very, very improbable. Yeah. Look, Zaphod, she said, patting his arm. Don't worry about the aliens. They're just a couple of guys, I expect. I'll send the robot down to get them and bring them up here. Hey, Marvin. In the corner of the robot's head swung up sharply, then wobbled about imperceptibly. It pulled itself up to its feet as if it were about 5 pounds heavier than it actually was, and made what an outside observer would have thought was a heroic effort to cross the room. It stopped in front of Trillian and seemed to stare through her left shoulder. I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed, it said. Its voice was low and hopeless. Oh, God, muttered Zaphod and slumped into his seat. Well, said Trillian in a bright, compassionate tone, here's something to occupy you and keep your mind off things. It won't work, droned Marvin. I have an exceptionally large mind. Marvin, warned Trillian. All right, said Marvin. What do you want me to do? Go down to number 2 entry bay and bring the 2 aliens up here under surveillance. With a microsecond pause and a finely calculated micromodulation of pitch and timbre, nothing you could actually take offense at, Marvin managed to convey his utter contempt and horror of all things human. Just that? He said. Yes, said Trillian firmly. I won't enjoy it, said Marvin, as Zaphod leapt out of his seat. She is not asking you to enjoy it, he shouted. Just do it, will you? All right, said Marvin. Like the tolling of a great cracked bell, I'll do it. Good, snapped Zaphod. Great, thank you. Marvin turned and lifted his flat-topped triangular eyes up toward him. I'm not letting you down at all, am I? He said pathetically. No, Marvin, lilted Trillian. That's just fine, really. I wouldn't like to think I was getting you down. No, don't worry about that, the lilt continued. You just act as comes naturally and everything will be just fine. You're sure you don't mind? Probed Marvin. No, Marvin, wilted Trillian. That's just fine, really. Just part of life. Marvin flashed her an electronic look. Life, said Marvin. Don't talk to me about life. He turned hopelessly on his heel and lugged himself out of the cabin. With a satisfied hum and a click, the door closed behind him. I don't think I can stand that robot much longer, Zaphod, growled Trillian. The Encyclopedia Galactica defines a robot as a mechanical apparatus designed to do the work of a man. The marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation defines a robot as your plastic pal who's fun to be with. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy defines the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who will be the first against the wall when the revolution comes. With a footnote to the effect that the editors would welcome applications from anyone interested in taking over the post of robotics correspondence. Curiously enough, an edition of the Encyclopedia Galactica that had the good fortune to fall through a time warp from 1,000 years in the future defined the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who were the first against the wall when the revolution came. The pink cubicle had winked out of existence. The monkeys had sunk away to a better dimension. Ford and Arthur found themselves in the embarkation area of the ship. It was rather smart. I think this ship's brand new, said Ford. How can you tell? Asked Arthur. Have you got some exotic device for measuring the age of metal? No, I just found this sales brochure lying on the floor. It's a lot of the universe can be yours stuff. Ah, look, I was right. Ford jabbed at one of the pages and showed it to Arthur. It says, sensational new breakthrough in improbability physics. As soon as the ship's drive reaches infinite improbability, it passes through every point in the universe. Be the envy of other major governments. Wow, this is big league stuff. Ford hunted excitedly through the technical specs of the ship, occasionally gasping with astonishment at what he had missed during the years of his exile. Arthur listened for a short while, but being unable to understand the vast majority of what Ford was saying, he began to let his mind wander, trailing his fingers along the edge of an incomprehensible computer bank. He reached out and pressed an invitingly large red button on a nearby panel. The panel lit up with the words, "Please do not press this button again." He shook himself. "Listen," said Ford, who was still engrossed in the sales brochure. They make a big thing of the ship's cybernetics, a new generation of Sirius Cybernetics Corporation robots and computers with the new GPP feature. A GPP feature, said Arthur. What's that? Oh, it says genuine people personalities. Oh, said Arthur. Sounds ghastly. A voice behind them says, "It is." The voice was low and hopeless and accompanied by a slight clanking sound. They spun around and saw an abject steel man standing hunched in the doorway. "What?" They said. "Ghastly," continued Marvin. "It all is. Absolutely ghastly. Just don't even talk about it. Look at this door," he said, stepping through it. The irony circuits cut into his voice modulator as he mimicked the style of the sales brochure. "All the doors in this spaceship have a cheerful and sunny disposition. It is their pleasure to open for you, and their satisfaction to close again with the knowledge of a job well done." As the door closed behind them, it became apparent that it did indeed have a satisfied, sigh-like quality to it. "Ah," it said. Marvin regarded it with cold loathing, while its logic circuits chattered with disgust and tinkered with the concept of directing physical violence against it. Further circuits cut in, saying, "Why bother? What's the point? Nothing is worth getting involved in." Further circuits amused themselves by analyzing the molecular components of the door and of the humanoid's brain cells. For a quick encore, they measured the level of hydrogen emissions in the surrounding cubic parsec of space and then shut down again in boredom. A spasm of despair shook the robot's body as he turned. Come on, he droned. I've been ordered to take you down to the bridge. Here I am, brain the size of a planet, and they asked me to take you down to the bridge. Call that job satisfaction? 'Cause I don't. He turned and walked back to the hated door. Excuse me, said Ford, following after him. Which government owns this ship? Marvin ignored him. You watch this door, he muttered. It's about to open again, and I can tell by the intolerable air of smugness it suddenly generates. With an ingratiating little whine, the door slid open again, and Marvin stomped through. Come on, he said. The others followed quickly, and the door slid back into place with pleased little clicks and whirs. Thank you, the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, said Marvin, and trudged desolately up the gleaming, curved corridor that stretched out before them. Let's build robots with genuine people personalities, they said. So they tried it out with me. I'm a personality prototype. You can tell, can't you? Ford and Arthur muttered embarrassed little disclaimers. I hate that door, continued Marvin. I'm not getting you down at all, am I? Which government? Started Ford again. No government owns it, snapped the robot. It's been stolen. Stolen? Stolen, mimicked Marvin. Who by? Asked Ford. Zaphod Beeblebrox. Something extraordinary happened to Ford's face. At least 5 entirely separate and distinct expressions of shock and amazement piled up on it in a jumbled mess. His left leg, which was mid-stride, seemed to have a difficulty in finding the floor again. He stared at the robot and tried to disentangle some dartoid muscles. Zaphod Beeblebrox, he said weakly. Sorry, did I say something wrong? Said Marvin, dragging himself on regardless. Pardon me for breathing, which I never do anyway, so I don't know why I bothered to say it. Oh God, I'm so depressed. Here's another of those self-satisfied doors. Life. Don't talk to me about life. No one even mentioned it, muttered Arthur irritably. Ford, are you alright? Ford stared at him. Did that robot say Zaphod Beeblebrox? Chapter 12. A loud clatter of gunk music flooded through the heart of Gold Cabin as Zaphod searched the subether radio wave bands for news of himself. The machine was rather difficult to operate. For years, radios had been operated by means of pressing buttons and turning dials. Then, as the technology became more sophisticated, the controls were made touch-sensitive. You merely had to brush the panels with your fingers, and now all you had to do was wave your hand in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot of muscular expenditure, of course, but meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. Zaphod waved a hand, and the channel switched again. More gunk music, but this time it was a background to a news announcement. The news was always heavily edited to fit the rhythms of the music. And news reports brought to you here on the subether wave band, broadcasting around the galaxy, around the clock, squawked a voice, and we'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere, and to everyone else out there. The secret is to bang the rocks together, guys. And, of course, the big news story tonight is the sensational theft of the new improbability drive prototype ship by none other than Galactic President Zaphod Beeblebrox. And the question everyone is asking is, has the Big Z finally flipped? Beeblebrox, the man who invented the pan-galactic Gargle Blaster, ex-confidence trickster, once described by Eccentrica Golumbits as the best bang since the big one, and recently voted the worst-dressed sentient being in the known universe for the 7th time. Has he got an answer this time? We asked his private brain care specialist, Gag Halfront. The music swirled and died for a moment. Another voice broke in, presumably Halfront. He said, "Well, Zephyr's just this guy, you know." But got no further because an electric pencil flew across the cabin and through the radio's on and off sensitive airspace. Zaphod turned and glared at Trillian. She had thrown the pencil. "Hey," he said, "what did you do that for?" Trillian was tapping her finger on a screen full of figures. "I've just thought of something," she said. "Yeah, worth interrupting a news bulletin about me for? You hear enough about yourself as it is. I'm very insecure, we know that. Can we drop your ego for a moment? This is important. If there's anything more important than my ego around, I want it caught and shot now." Zavod glared at her again and then laughed. "Listen," she said, "we picked up those couple of guys." "What couple of guys?" "The couple of guys we picked up." "Oh yeah," said Zavod, "those couple of guys. We picked them up in Sector ZZ, plural Z, Alpha." "Yeah?" said Zaphod and blinked. Trillian said quietly, "Does that mean anything to you?" Said Zaphod, ZZ, plural Z, Alpha, ZZ, plural Z, Alpha. "Well," Trillian said. What does the Z mean?" said Zaphod. "Which one? Anyone." Any one of the major difficulties Trillian experienced with her relationship with Zaphod was learning to distinguish between him pretending to be stupid just to get people off their guard, pretending to be stupid because he couldn't be bothered to think and wanted someone else to do it for him, pretending to be outrageously stupid to hide the fact that he actually didn't understand what was going on, and really being genuinely stupid. He was renowned for being amazingly clever, and quite clearly was so, but not all the time, which obviously worried him, hence the act. He preferred people to be puzzled, rather than contemptuous. This, above all, appeared to Trillian to be genuinely stupid. But she could no longer be bothered to argue about it. She sighed and punched up a star map on the Visa screen, so she could make it simple for him, whatever his reasons for wanting it to be that way. "There," she pointed, "right there." "Hey, yeah," said Zaphod. Well, what?" Parts of the inside of her head screamed at other parts of the inside of her head, and she said very calmly, "It's the same sector you originally picked me up in." He looked at her and then looked back at the screen. "Hey, yeah," he said. "Now that is wild. We should have zapped straight into the middle of the Horsehead Nebula. How did we come to be there? I mean, that's nowhere." She ignored this. "Improbability drive," she said patiently. "You explained it to me yourself. We passed through every point in the universe. You know that." "Yeah, but that's one wild coincidence, isn't it?" "Yes. Picking someone up at that point out of the whole universe to choose from, that's just too... I want to work this out, computer." The serious cybernetic shipboard computer, which controlled and permeated every particle of the ship, switched into communication mode. "Hi there," it said brightly, and simultaneously spewed out a tiny ribbon of ticker tape just for the record. The ticker tape said, "Hi there." "Oh, God," said Zaphod. He hadn't worked with this computer for long and had already learned to loathe it. The computer continued, brash and cheery, as if it were selling detergent. "I want you to know that whatever your problem, I'm here to help you solve it." Yeah, said Zaphod. "Look, I think I'll just use a piece of paper." "Sure thing," said the computer, spilling out its message into a waste bin at the same time. "I understand if you ever want..." "Shut up," said Zaphod, and snatching a pencil and sat down next to Trillian at the console. Okay, said the computer in a hurt tone of voice, and closed down its speech channel again. Zaphod and Trillian pored over the figures that the improbability flight path scanner flashed silently up in front of them. Can we work out, said Zaphod, from their point of view, what the improbability of their rescue was? Yeah, that's constant, said Trillian. 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. That's high. They're two lucky guys. Yeah, but relative to what we were doing when the ship picked them up. Trillian punched up the figures. They showed 2 to the power of infinity minus 1 to 1 against. An irrational number that only has a conventional meaning in improbability physics. That's pretty low, continued Zaphod with a slight whistle. Yes, agreed Trillian, and looked at him quizzically. That's one big whack of improbability to be accounted for. Something pretty improbable has got to show up on the balance sheet if it's all going to add up into a pretty sum. Zaphod scribbled a few sums, crossed them out, and threw the pencil away. That's dues. I can't work it out. Well, Zaphod knocked his two heads together in irritation and gritted his teeth. Okay, he said. Computer. The voice circuit sprang to life. Why, hello there, it said. Ticker tape, ticker tape. All I want to do is make your day nicer and nicer and nicer. Yeah, well, shut up and work something out for me. Sure thing, chattered the computer. You want a probability forecast based on improbability data, yeah. Okay. The computer continued. Here's an interesting little notion. Did you realize that most people's lives are governed by telephone numbers? A pained look crawled across Zaphod's face and on one to the other. Have you flipped? He said. No, but you will when I tell you that. Trillian gasped. She scrabbled at the buttons on the improbability flight path screen. Telephone number, she said. Did that thing say telephone number? Numbers flashed up on the screen. The computer had paused politely, but now it continued. What I was about to say was that, don't bother, please, said Trillian. Look, what is this? Said Zaphod. I don't know, said Trillian, but those aliens, they're on the way up to the bridge with that wretched robot. Can we pick them up on any monitor cameras? All right. So, as much as I would like to keep on reading, y'all, I have to go and get ready for the day job. Actually, I have a bookmark. All right, so I hope you enjoy that. Tonight we will do some more reading. And then we'll get on with my day. So, namaste. See you guys later.